Soldier's Heart by Alex 51324. Chapter 13. January to March 1916. In the new year, they started getting regular ward work. Every other week, usually, with the alternate ones spent on fatigues and so forth with the shell shock patients. They were most often assigned to the shell shock wards. Major Winthrop, who was in charge of the psychiatric section, apparently believed women were a bad influence on the Barmy. But there wasn't nearly enough work on those wards to occupy them all, the men being expected to make their own beds, clean the barracks, and so on as they recovered. So members of Thomas's section were often peeled off in ones and twos to assist on other wards, and he had many occasions to repeat the lecture about the treatment of and attitudes toward nurses. Fatigues with the tutty blokes were an exercise in Sisyphean frustration, because as soon as any one of them had improved enough to be reliable, he was sent back to the front. It was much rarer for anyone to be sent on to the specialist hospital in England, even if he got steadily worse. So Thomas was a bit surprised when, one day in February, Rouse, who was on wards that week, came up to his work detail and told the bloke called Simmons to go back to the ward and pack his kit for Blighty. "What are they taking him for?" Thomas asked when Simmons was out of earshot. "He's one of my best workers." Rouse stared at him. "He thinks he's dead, mate." Thomas knew that. Simmons didn't mind talking about it. He had apparently been on a patrol which was struck by a shrapnel shell. All of the other blokes had been killed, most of them instantly, so Simmons, somehow left without a mark on him, had come to the reasonable enough conclusion that he was also dead. So? It wasn't like it stopped him working. Plenty of others got sent back to the front while they still claimed to be quite poor in their nerves, as long as they could stand up straight and carry out their duties. "He's completely off his rocker," Rouse said. "So's half the general staff," Thomas pointed out. "Anyway, he's keen to get back to the fighting. Says you might as well, since they can't kill him again." "But they can, because he's not dead." "I know, but neither are any of the others. I don't see how it makes sense to send back the ones that don't want to go and send home the one that does." Rouse hesitated. "Well, when you put it like that, I guess—" Thomas shrugged and said, "Better get back to it." They were digging graves that day. They didn't need them just yet, but they were having an early thaw, and someone or another had decided they might as well get some done before the ground froze again. It was surprisingly sensible, he thought, especially considering the idea must have come from an officer. The next week he was back on wards. D7 this time, which was for men with both shell shock and wounds. It was a bit more interesting than the other shell shock wards because there was medical work to do, dressing changes and so on. He had just finished one and was carrying the soiled bandages to the bin when someone said, "Thomas?" It had been so long since he'd heard his Christian name spoken aloud that his first thought was that they must have a patient with a surname Thomas. But he looked anyway and saw Theo! It was Theo, thinner than Thomas had ever seen him, his face covered in a day or two's worth of stubble. "Christ, what are you doing here?" "What do you think?" Theo asked. "I cut a packet and I've gone a bit balmy." "Well, yes, of course." "I wasn't sure you were still alive," Thomas added. "I wasn't sure you were either." He held up the basin of bandages. "Let me get rid of these, and then I've got one or two others to do, and then we'll talk, all right?" "I'll be here," Theo said. When Thomas consulted the list for dressing changes, he found that Theo was in fact on it. The surname hadn't registered. It wasn't an unusual one. He gave the couple of patients above Theo on the list to Rollins and Perkins, and took Theo's case for himself. It was a thigh wound, and healing nicely, with just a tiny bit of inflammation. "Doesn't look too bad," Thomas observed. "No," Theo said. "To be honest, when I got it, I was rather hoping it would be a blighty one. Well, no such luck." "No," Thomas agreed, sloshing in some disinfectant. "Oh, you have to use quite so much of that stuff. It hurts like a bugger." "I don't know. Do you want to keep your leg?" Said Theo. "That's a tough one." Thomas was not entirely sure that he was joking. "Best if you do," they said. "They say it's not too bad having a wooden leg from the knee down, but above the knee is a lot harder." "Oh, right." Theo went on to catch him up on a few other members of their circle that he knew to still be alive. Drew, apparently, had lost both hands. He'd been an artilleryman. There were all sorts of ways for that to happen, and been sent home to live with his married sister.
I've no idea how he's really doing. She writes his letters for him, so all he said was that he'd arrived and they were taking good care of him.
Reg was in a unit fighting in one of the sideshows down by Turkey, and had been doing all right the last time Theo had heard.
He was in Flanders before, says it's not nearly as bad where he is now.
There were, of course, a lot more names that neither of them mentioned.
What about you?
Theo asked.
Are you doing all right?
Oh, sure. It's pretty cushy here. Thomas hesitated. You? It was, in a way, a stupid question. Obviously he wasn't all right, or he wouldn't be here.
Not as bad as some,
Theo answered.
I'm having a lot of trouble sleeping. Bad dreams. I expect they sent me down here so I'd stop waking everyone else up.
Thomas nodded.
That's common enough here. I really haven't gotten over Syl, Thomas went on. That was so... I'm still carrying around his stupid fucking lip rouge. That's the other thing I thought when I got shot this time. That if they sent me to the same place as last time, I could finally give it to him. Leave it on his grave.
Thomas said, nodding. What were you supposed to say about something like that?
I hung on to his stockings for a while too, but we ended up using those to strain the mud out of drinking water. Had to make up a story about buying them to send home to a girl.
That reminded Thomas of something. If you talked to any of the other blokes here, Peter's meant to be my brother. Rouse, the corporal from one of the other sections, knew him. So, might come up. Theo nodded.
I remember. Christ. Peter. That was awful too. I didn't really... I mean, it happened about the same time as Syl, so I didn't... You joined up right after that, didn't you?
Yeah, seemed like the thing to do.
I suppose. That was... You and him. That would have been good. For both of you.
Don't, said Thomas. I can't. He could think about Peter a bit now, but he couldn't think about what they could have been.
Sorry,
said Theo. It's all right, Thomas said. It's just... I'm working,
I understand. Do you need to get back to it?
He wanted to, but there wasn't really anything he needed to be doing at the moment. Not just yet. He set a basin of soiled bandages on the floor and lit a cigarette, offering the packet to Theo. Duh. Theo took one and Thomas lit it for him.
What's it like here?
Glad for an impersonal subject to discuss, Thomas told him a bit about the ward routines, adding, If they decide you're still balmy after your leg's better, they'll have you out doing fatigues. It's part of the cure.
Oh, jolly,
said Theo. It's not so bad. My section runs some of the work details when we're not on duty in here.
I'm sure it'll be fine. And if I don't feel up to butling again after the war, I'll be ideally positioned to begin a new career as a ditch digger.
There's an idea. Thomas hadn't given a moment's thought since joining the army to what he'd do for work if the war ever ended. How likely was it that they'd want him back at the Abbey? I'll be the foreman. I'm good at that now.
You can have it, Theo agreed. I think my trouble sleeping started when they made me a sergeant.
Oh, they did! With Theo dressed in hospital pajamas, there was no way to tell, and he'd missed noticing it on the patient list.
Theo nodded. A couple of months ago, I get these dreams where it's all of us from the old days. The old days of a year and a half ago, and we're on a butter rolling. Ugh. Sometimes we're trying to get to the Criterion, only it's on the other side of no man's land, and I get there, and I'm the only one left.
He managed a weak smile.
Perhaps seeing you will help with that. I'll imagine that you're already inside.
You, me, and Philip Crowborough, Thomas said.
You've seen him?
Thomas asked. God, no! He's staying home. Heart condition, supposedly. He wrote me just before... to tell me somebody or other had been killed, and he mentioned it.
Oh, said Theo. Well, that's cozy. Perhaps I could be his butler, and you could be his valet when we're the only three of our sort left alive.
Could we dig ditches instead? Thomas asked.
Let's do.
Theo agreed. A bit after that, Major Winthrop came in on rounds, and Thomas really did have to get back to work. Over the next few days, Thomas talked to Theo when he could. It was hard going because Theo tended to focus on his nightmares, how wretched he felt over Syl and Peter and all the others, and half-baked plans for after the war, none of which were subjects Thomas wanted to talk about. Also troubling was the way he rambled from one of these topics to another and back again. He'd always been a chatty sort of bloke, but he'd never been scatterbrained. Now he seemed to lose track of what he'd been talking about from one moment to the next, let alone which pieces of news he'd already told Thomas. So when one night he was having a midnight cigarette on the steps and Rouse turned up, he was on night duty in the wards, and said, "Barrow, can you come over to the ward for a minute?" Thomas's first thought was that something had happened to Theo. He stood up. "What happened? Is it Theo? Sergeant Hill." "What? Oh, that mate of yours. No, I'm in D5 tonight." "What is it then?" Thomas asked, starting on the path toward the D wards. If it wasn't Theo, he couldn't think what sort of emergency would call for him and not say one of the medical officers. "Since you're up, I wondered if you could keep an eye on things for a bit," Rouse explained. "Well, you do what?" Thomas asked. He supposed he could, if it was important, but if Rouse just wanted to go get a drink or something, he was going back to bed. Rouse said. "Break into the X-ray department?" "What?" "You know Kingston?" Thomas didn't really keep track of their names unless he had them on his work crews. "Remind me." "Older bloke, short, can't walk." "Oh, him." The ones that thought they couldn't walk were a real pain in the arse because the major wouldn't let you bring them bedbands, so there was a lot of completely unnecessary cleaning up to do, in addition to it being embarrassing for all concerned. "Thought he was up and about a bit now, though." "He is, but something's off. He's complaining of hip pain, and the thing is it responds to morphine and not to sugar pills." "You're not supposed to give them the real stuff for hysterical pain," Thomas pointed out. "I know, but there were some other strange things about the case, too. The gait abnormalities are not what we usually see with hysteria. The pain worsens with activity, and I'd swear there's some inflammation at the site." It took Thomas a moment to realize what he was getting at. "You think there's actually something wrong with him?" "With his leg, yeah." "Then you should tell one of the MOs. "I tried that, got the brush off, didn't I? So I tried giving him the morphine and it worked. But I can't admit I did that until I have some kind of proof there's actually a physical problem." So the easiest way I can prove it is if there's something on the x-rays that they missed." Thomas spotted the flaw in his logic. "You can't admit you broke into the x-ray department and looked at them," he pointed out. "What you've got to do is get someone to show them to you." "Yeah, that might work if you tried it. McAllister just told me to keep to my job. McAllister just told me to keep to my own job." "Then you should," Thomas said. If the medical officers said there was nothing wrong with the bloke, that was the end of the story as far as he was concerned. Rouse didn't see it that way, though. This wasn't the first time he'd argued with one of the medical officers about a patient. "You're going to get in trouble." "That's my lookout," he said. "Come on, be a pal." Thomas groaned. "If there's nothing on the x-rays, will you drop it?" "No," said Rouse. "Could be a soft tissue injury. Look, now that he's getting himself to the latrine, it's not going to be long before they have him out on fatigues. If he is injured, that can make it a lot worse." "And why is that a problem?" Rouse shot him a look of disgust. "Really? Would you give a shit if it was your mate Hill?" "That's a low shot, and you know it." "You're being a bit of a cunt, and you know it." He paused. "And if you want to talk about low shots, don't even say it," Thomas warned him. Peter would do it. Of course he would. He sighed. "Fine, but if you get caught, I'm saying you told me you were in the latrine with dysentery." "Theo!" Rouse said. "Shouldn't take me more than 20 minutes. Half an hour tops." "Don't get caught." Thomas sat at the desk in the middle of the ward, idly looking over Rouse's paperwork. He was none too thorough about it, and Thomas automatically corrected a few of the more glaring omissions. Honestly, if Rouse wondered why the MOs hadn't warmed up to him, he ought to try being as diligent about the things he was supposed to do as he was about the things he wasn't. All the while, Thomas was on the alert for a hue and cry from the direction of the X-ray hut. Not, he realized after a bit, that there'd likely be one. The initial assumption, on finding an orderly in the X-ray shed, would be that someone had sent him there for something. It wasn't until Rouse started running his mouth that he'd get in trouble. What Thomas really ought to have done was come up with a story for him about why he was in there. He wasn't sure what it could be. If they were at the 47th, he could say Captain Allenby had asked for Kingston's films, with a decent chance he'd back them up, especially if Thomas managed to get to him before anyone asked. Here, though, while the MOs did talk to him a bit more than they did to Rouse, probably because he wasn't challenging them at every turn, and even when he did think they were being fatheads, he had the sense to hide it. There wasn't one of them he'd trust to cover for him. On the other hand, if he was imagining they were at the 47th, he might as well imagine that the wardmaster knew that Rouse had a bee in his bonnet about Kingston and had sorted him out already, quite possibly by giving him a chance to look at the fucking x-rays legitimately. That seemed like something he might do. Finally, after closer to 3/4 of an hour than half, Rouse came back. "Did you get caught?" Thomas asked. Rouse shook his head and motioned for Thomas to join him in the sink room. "Didn't find anything," he said once they were in there. "The images were bad. I think they just took them to point at and tell the poor bastard there's nothing wrong with him. There was only one angle on the pelvis, and you could barely see the head of the femur at all. That's where I think the problem is, so they're fucking useless." "What are you going to do now?" "I don't know yet. Any ideas?" "I already told you what I think," Thomas reminded him. "It's not our job to catch things the MOs missed." If there even was something. "This is important," Rouse said. "They may not care how unwell these men are mentally when they send them back to the front, but if he's injured, they have to care about that." There was no point arguing with him, Thomas knew. Rouse was stubborn, so he tried to think of something Rouse could do that wouldn't get either of them in trouble. But all he could think of were things that might have worked if they were at the 47th. "What about the sergeants? Can you get one of them on your side about this?" "Chance would be a fine thing," said Rouse. "Don't know if you've noticed, but I'm not anyone's favorite around here." "Because you're always arguing with them," Thomas pointed out. "I have to get anyone to listen to me." Thomas remembered vaguely feeling that way. Not arguing, that had never been his style, but maneuvering, always thinking 3 or 4 steps ahead to try and end up where he wanted to be. Life was so much easier now that he didn't want things. "I'm out of ideas," he said, "and if you don't mind, I'm going to bed." Rouse waved him off. "Yeah, sure. Thanks for..." He gestured vaguely toward the ward. "I'll keep thinking on it." Thomas wished he wouldn't, but didn't argue. "So you knew Barrow before the war, right?" Private Rollins asked, laying out the things for changing Theo's bandage. "What was he like?" "A lot like he is now," Theo said. It was strange, really, how little Thomas seemed to have changed. His manners had roughened a bit. He certainly swore more. But under that, he was still the Ice Prince, watching the rest of them from his golden, lonely splendor. "Yeah," said Rollins, beginning to cut away Theo's old bandages. "I suppose that's not surprising. When he first came here, he seemed like he was used to it already somehow. We all noticed it." "I've heard the story about the aunt," Theo said dryly, several times in fact. It would be surprising, he supposed, to someone who had seen only Thomas's smooth, polished neatness, or his studied air of not caring about anything or anyone. But it was the same Thomas who had cheerfully beaten the living crap out of a so-called gentleman who had dared force himself on Syl all those years ago, and then come back to Theo and Peter for patching up bloodied and disheveled and obviously proud of himself, claiming all the while that he didn't even like Syl, and that the act had no altruistic motivations whatsoever. That was the first time he'd done something like that, but it wasn't the last. He was their Ice Prince, but he was also their battering ram, or their guard dog, or the old-fashioned kind of prince, the kind that slew dragons. "That was something," Rollins agreed. "You know, they made him a lance corporal the first time when he'd been here a month. Nobody minded. It's just that impressive." And now that part was surprising. Thomas had always struggled with fitting in. All of their sort were square pegs in round holes, but there wasn't a space on earth for the shape Thomas was. He was fairly good at squeezing himself into the spaces where he almost fit, being a servant, drinking at the far end of the Criterion bar. But he resented the hell out of it, and if you looked closely, you could always tell. Combined with his exquisite good looks, that sense of always being a little apart gave him a mysterious allure. But a man who didn't want to sleep with him, he usually came off as a bit of a prick. Here, though, it was different somehow. The men in his section couldn't possibly all be queers. But Thomas seemed to hold something of the same sort of magnetic fascination for them. Rollins wasn't the first to come to him with questions about what their Corporal Barrow was really like. At first, Theo hadn't been able to answer. He'd been too exhausted to think straight. But they'd been giving him something to help him sleep, and now he had a theory. But it wasn't something you could say to anyone as ordinary as Rollins, especially not if you were already considered halfway to being mad. But if Peter were here, if Peter were anywhere to which a letter could be sent, he'd say, Thomas has always been at war with the world. Here now, everyone else is too. The war wasn't the answer Thomas had been looking for all this time, a space where he would fit, but it was a space nobody else fit either. Nobody could fit in a place where sorting through a pile of hacked-off pieces of men's bodies in search of a wedding ring was a reasonable and even admirable thing to do, or where you were expected, if you got the chance, to walk up to a complete stranger and, without preamble, shove 17 inches of steel into his heart, gut, or eye socket, or where you could be having a cuppa and a smoke and then suddenly be wearing the blood and guts of the man next to you. You had to just accept that the world you were in didn't make any sense, that horrible things happened all the time for no reason, and that there was no getting away from any of it. That adjustment, not how much combat you'd seen, or how many men you'd killed, or how many of your mates you'd seen die, was what marked you as an experienced man, no longer an apprentice of war, as someone who knows what it's like. Men like them, London peculiars, as Peter had put it, had learned a long time ago that the world didn't make sense, that destruction could crash down from the heavens when you were only trying to have a drink or find some company, and that there was no better world you could escape into. Some of them, Thomas certainly, and Syl, though in very different ways, had never known the world to be any other way. They'd come into the war already equipped with the armor they needed. One of Thomas's mates, the other corporal, Theo thought, had said that Thomas took to work on the front as though he had been born to it. That was, quite simply, because he had. But Rollins didn't want to hear any of that. What he wanted to hear was a boys' school story, perhaps something where Thomas won the big cricket match or bested the bully. Well, he could manage the latter if he changed a few of the details. What could he say had happened to Syl? He had, in fact, been sacked, in addition to everything else. That would do as a motive. And for a climax, Thomas had gotten Sir Gilbert to hand over the wages he was owed, although that had been an afterthought. The point was to give him enough of a beating he wouldn't dare show his face in any of their regular haunts again.
Have you heard the one about the time he beat up the baronet? No? This was when we were all working in London, quite a few years ago. Thomas was about 17, I think. Our friend Sylvester, got sacked for no very good reason at all.
No! Thomas said. Absolutely not! There's nobody else I can ask, Rouse said. Maybe you should take a hint from that. Thomas was starting to wonder if Rouse's fixation with Kingston's imaginary leg injury was one of those times when he had to, as the wardmaster put it, pass the shit up the chain before it stuck to him. Except that Rouse wasn't one of his section, and the wardmaster hadn't covered what to do if one of your fellow corporals was fucking up. Thomas had thought over the last few days that Rouse might have decided to take his advice and let the matter drop. It turned out, however, that he'd instead been cooking up an even more insane scheme. Namely, breaking into the X-ray department in the middle of the night again, this time bringing Kingston with him and taking some new films of the area where Rouse believed the injury was. What he'd been doing the last few days was enlisting the aid of another corporal who worked in the X-ray hut and had some idea of how to work the machine and develop the films. The part Rouse proposed for Thomas to play was simply to cover the ward again, while Rouse was off executing the really risky parts of the plan, but he still didn't want to do it. What if you break the bleeding machine, mucking around with it? I bet that thing cost a fortune. They'll have your head. It's not that complicated, Rouse said. It's like a big camera. I understand how it works now.
And have you figured out how you're going to explain these new X-rays? Assuming you actually find something on them.
If I find something on them, I'll admit I took them on the sly, Rouse answered. If I have proof, they have to believe me. That wasn't the point.
It's still insubordination. How many times have you been told to stop interfering?
Earlier that day, when Thomas had been working on the ward, Major Winthrop had told Kingston he was to report for fatigues and drill the next day, and Kingston had argued with him, saying that the young doctor said he needed more X-rays to diagnose his leg injury. Winthrop, naturally, had demanded to know which doctor that was. and it had eventually emerged that he was talking about Rouse. Thomas had sought Rouse out to tell him that the Major was out for his blood, but he had barely mentioned Kingston's name before Rouse had said yes, he'd already heard, and launched into asking Thomas to help with his plan. "Look," Thomas said, "I'm not sure you realize what thin fucking ice you're on with the Major. Did you actually tell Kingston you were a doctor?" "No," said Rouse. "I said I was a medical student, which I am." "Not anymore," said Thomas. "You're an orderly, same as me, and as far as Major Winthrop's concerned, you're impersonating an officer." He used those words. "It's not my fault he thinks a doctor and an officer are the same thing." "It doesn't matter whether it's your fault or not, Christ. What do you think is going to happen here?" "I think I'm going to find out that Kingston has a femoral head fracture," Rouse said, "or possibly a pelvic fracture, but they're less likely to have missed that. Femoral head fractures cause an apparent shortening of the limb, which can look a lot like the muscle contractures you get with shell shock, and it would have been masked by the initial presentation of hysterical paralysis, but—" Thomas cut him off. "What do you think is going to happen to you? You think they're going to shake your hand and say, 'Thank you for making us look like idiots, we'll take you seriously now'?" "No," said Rouse. "I expect I'll get a bollocking, I don't care. You'll be lucky if that's all you get. You want to lose your stripes again?" Rouse shrugged. "I can live with it. Look, it'll take maybe an hour. If I get caught, you can tell them I'm in the latrine with the shits if you want." "And you took Kingston with you for company?" "No," said Rouse. "You could say... There's gotta be something you can say." Thomas sighed. If he didn't help, Rouse was just going to do something even stupider, like leave the bloody ward unattended while he went off on his fool's errand, or worse, rope one of the other lads into it. "You told me you were taking him to a whorehouse." Sex was really the best explanation for sneaking around at that hour. It would be even more plausible to suppose that Rouse and Kingston were having it off with each other, rather than bringing a prostitute into it. But that was a crime too, so we couldn't admit to knowing that. "That's idiotic," Rouse said. "Why would I take a man with a broken leg to a whorehouse? He's not going to be able to get his leg over." "Surely you've noticed that we of the other ranks are obsessed with sex. You have a soft spot for the bloke, you thought it would cheer him up a bit, and he hasn't got a broken leg, he's just balmy." Thomas shrugged. "That's what you told me, and I'm not nearly bright enough to have suspected any differently." Rouse sighed. "Fine, whenever you want to tell them." "Be vague about what you told me," Thomas said. "We're obsessed with sex, but we also know you're not supposed to mention it in front of the quality." When Thomas arrived at Ward D5 in the middle of the night, Rouse already had Kingston bundled up in somebody's greatcoat and sitting in a bath chair. "Thought maybe you weren't coming," Rouse said. "I said I would, didn't I?" "Against his better judgment." "Go, let's get this idiocy over with." Rouse wheeled Kingston out of the ward. Thomas had to help him get the chair down the stairs, something that would be very hard to fit into the whorehouse story if it came to that, but perhaps they wouldn't think to ask. As with the last time, Thomas was left waiting and worrying long after the time Rouse had said he'd be back. It was almost 2 hours, and one nightmare on the part of bed 14, who woke up half the ward yelling about it, before the door to the ward opened. Banged open, causing half the balmy blokes to jolt awake. Kingston shuffled in, sans bath chair, accompanied by an officer and 2 men, neither of whom was Rouse. When they came by the desk, Thomas saw that the officer was Major Winthrop. He ordered Kingston to bed, and the rest of the men back to sleep, and left, without so much as glance at Thomas. Fuck. No one, as it turned out, thought to ask what Thomas was doing in D5 that night. As far as he knew, Major Winthrop hadn't even noticed that he was there. The only one who did notice anything unusual was Leighton, who took over as ward corporal in the morning. "Isn't Rouse on nights this week?" he asked. "Covering for him," Thomas said, and raced off to join his own section on sentry duty. The others had noticed that Thomas and Rouse were missing when they got up that morning, and were full of questions about it, but seemed no one was much surprised when Thomas didn't indulge their curiosity, saying only that he'd been covering D5 for the last few hours of the night shift. It wasn't until they went in to lunch that Thomas learned anything new, and the way he learned it was from Leighton saying, "What did your mate do to get crucified, anyway?" "What?" Thomas asked stupidly. "Rouse," Blythe explained.
He's on FP1. I saw them tying him up while we were coming in from fatigues.
God damn it!
Insubordination, I reckon, Thomas said, trying not to show he was rattled. It would be easier if he'd slept or eaten anything since last night's dinner. Has anyone heard how long they gave him? No one had, but Lighton said, busted him back to the ranks, though. They'd have had to, Thomas said absently. NCOs didn't get FP. At least no one knew he'd played any part in it. Rouse wouldn't drop him in the shit. Wonder who they'll put up to replace him, Lighton said. You have any ideas, Barrow? No, Thomas said, and ate mechanically, ignoring the churning in his gut. He had an afternoon of fatigues to get through. He couldn't do it on cigarettes alone. Their work assignment was mindless, even as fatigues went, unloading building materials at the railhead and carrying them to the place where the E wards were going to be. It didn't even require breaking them up into working parties, though Thomas did tap Rollins and Manning to help him keep things organized, and all of the patients were ones they'd had before, except for Kingston. It seemed a mercy right up until the first time they crossed, with Kingston shuffling along under one end of a load of lumber past the parade ground where Rouse was doing his FP. They had him tied between two posts, his arms stretched out. That was why they called it crucifixion when it was done that way. He looked fairly casual about it, almost bored, until he saw them. Saw Kingston, to be precise. Then he strained against the ropes holding him, swearing viciously. God damn you motherfuckers, you goddamn sons of bitches! Keep walking, Thomas told the others. He doesn't mean us. Just go. Don't look. Any doubts he had about whether the arrangement was pure sadism or just a really unfortunate coincidence were resolved when, on their third or fourth trip back to the railhead for more stuff to carry, they were met by Rouse's section. The newly promoted Lance Corporal Caton, a middle-class bloke, explained sheepishly that they'd been told that Thomas would tell them what they were doing. Goddamn motherfuckers indeed. It's easy enough, Thomas said. We're carrying this stuff up to the building site up past D Block. He hesitated. Eyes front when you pass the parade ground is my recommendation. Don't make it any worse than it is. Right, Kenyon said, nodding. You heard him. He told the rest of the section. Let's get on with it. While they were loading up, Thomas heard Blank ask Keaton, Aren't you lot on lights? They took us off it, Kenyon explained, because I've no experience leading the section, they said. Passing the parade ground, Rouse's former section tried to keep eyes front, at least though Thomas caught them sneaking glances at Rouse. Rouse, for his part, managed to keep his mouth shut, and so didn't make it any worse than it had to be either. After they'd put down their loads at the building site, Thomas contrived to fall in beside Kenyon. Did they tell you how long he's got? Kenyon shook his head. A week or two is what we heard. He hesitated. I didn't ask to be put up in his place, I mean. I wouldn't do that. Didn't think you had, Thomas said. They were nearly to the parade ground again. Eyes front, he reminded everyone, then continued. I told him this was going to happen if he kept on the way he was. That was something to do with Kingston, then. Thomas nodded. After 2 hours, Rouse was untied and taken somewhere else. Thomas wondered what they had him doing. It was usually either fatigues or pack drill on FB, but mostly he was relieved not to have to avoid looking at him for the rest of their work detail. He did, however, still have Kingston to deal with. He got slower and slower, and carried less and less with each trip back and forth. Thomas hadn't wanted to hassle him with Rouse forced to watch, but now he was starting to worry that someone might notice he was going easy on him, and Thomas would end up standing next to Rouse. The first time he barked, "Keep up!" at Kingston was a bit hard, but it got easier, and never seemed to have much effect anyway, except to demonstrate to anyone who might have been watching that Thomas was being firm. And if Kingston was in tears by the end of the work detail, that wasn't Thomas's problem, was it? They had an hour to themselves after work and before dinner, and Thomas, not particularly wanting to watch Kenyon get settled into Rouse's bunk, went to see Theo. He didn't need dressings on his leg anymore and seemed better mentally. Not his old self, but fairly focused, and not talking so much about his nightmares anymore. Thomas found himself telling him about Rouse. I don't know why he did it. I told him he was going to get in trouble. There's worse things in life than FP, Thomas pointed out. Maybe, Thomas said. Short of execution, he wasn't sure what. The very idea gave him the shudders. What they're putting that poor bugger Kingston through is worse, Thomas said. He was on drill with us this morning. I don't know if there's anything wrong with his leg or not, but it isn't right to make him walk on it when it hurts him that much.
Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his seat.
The doctors know what they're doing? I hope you're right.
He hesitated.
I think they'll be sending me back to my regiment soon.
It was not, Thomas thought, a complete change of subject.
Yeah? Theo nodded. Had my little chat with Major Winthrop this afternoon.
Little chats were another part of the treatment regime. Thomas had seen some of them working on the wards. They consisted mainly of the Major forcing the man to describe whatever terrible thing had happened to him just before his breakdown, then explaining the connection between that experience and the men's symptoms, and that the terrible thing, while terrible, was a part of war, and wasn't it really a bit silly to think that, for instance, your hands had stopped working just because you'd seen someone else get his blown off? At which point the men said, yes, sir, it was a bit silly, and he'd stop immediately.
What did he say? He said I'm not having nightmares anymore, so clearly all I needed was a bit of rest and to stop dwelling on unpleasant things.
That didn't sound too far off to Thomas.
Have you stopped having nightmares? I've stopped waking up screaming, so I'm sure that's the same thing.
Thomas shook his head.
I shouldn't make fun, really. He's said some helpful things in our other little chats. I started having the nightmares when I was made sergeant, he says, because I feel responsible for my men, for their safety. Which I do, and that feeling that way is part of what makes me a good NCO. I think that's true as well.
Thomas frowned.
So it makes me feel a bit better about it, to think that I'm having them because I'm good at my job, and not because I'm falling apart at the seams.
He shrugged.
And then he said I must remember that terrible things happen in war, and it isn't my job to stop them happening. That part wasn't so helpful, but there you go.
Theo managed something that looked like his old easy smile, but it made Thomas feel cold inside.
I wish you didn't have to go back,
he said. A stupid thing to say, really. What good would that do?
Me too,
said Theo.
But I do, and I'll be alright. All the action's down on the French part of the line now.
The French were getting torn to shreds from what Thomas had heard, and the Hun had managed an advance that could be measured by miles. Not a lot of miles, maybe 2 or 3, but for the last year the advance of yards was considered something to write home about. Sooner or later, whether the French stopped them or not, it was bound to affect their sector somehow. But Theo had to know that already, and there was no need to point it out.
Sure,
Thomas said. But it's nice and quiet. The next day they were on fatigues in the morning. Another thaw had come in, so they were put to digging graves again. The graveyard wasn't anywhere near the parade ground, so that was a bit of a relief, but the work was even harder on Kingston than carrying had been. It was the part where you stepped down on the shovel to use your weight to push it into the ground that gave him trouble. He couldn't get his foot up that high, or put his weight on it, no matter how much Thomas yelled at him about it. So he was doing less than nothing, getting in everyone else's way, really, when Major Winthrop turned up. He, as you word them quickly, but Thomas scrambled up out of the hole they were digging anyway and went over to him.
Sir?
Major Winthrop gave him a highly skeptical look.
I'm not sure what to do about him, sir,
Thomas said, inclining his head toward Kingston, who was standing at the edge of the hole and fairly obviously not digging. He was careful to keep his tone apologetic. I'm trying my best, sir, really I am. It's just that I'm far too ignorant for this.
He won't pick that foot up no matter what I say to him. Keeping him standing up is just about the best I've been able to do. Sir?
Major Winthrop nodded.
That's a difficult case, and the interference with it certainly hasn't helped. Kingston!
He barked. Kingston, who had already been standing at attention, stood straighter.
Sir? It doesn't look like you're doing your part here, are you? No, sir.
He gulped.
It's me legs, sir. I could just about manage the carrying yesterday, but this digging, sir, there's just no way.
We've been over this, the Major said, his voice dripping with patience. There isn't anything wrong with your leg, is there?
No, sir,
said Kingston obediently.
It's all in me head, sir. but it still hurts. You'll simply have to exercise some willpower, Winthrop said. He held out his hand. Give me that.
Cringing a little, Kingston handed him the shovel he'd been holding. Thomas wondered for a second if the Major was going to hit him with it. Instead, he selected a patch of ground, planted the point of the shovel, placed one mirror-polished riding boot on the step, and pressed down. Thomas wondered if the man had ever, in fact, used a shovel before in his life. He skipped the second part of the procedure, in which one actually lifted up the soil that had been loosened in the first stage, but he supposed that wasn't really the point.
Do you see how I did that?
Winthrop asked. He demonstrated again.
Now you do it.
He held the shovel out in Kingston's direction. Kingston took the shovel and, shifting his weight onto his good leg, drove the blade as far into the earth as he could manage with his hands alone. It was actually a bit more than Winthrop had managed using his foot, but Thomas knew perfectly well it wasn't going to be good enough.
Now, said Winthrop. Do it as I showed you.
Kingston gave Thomas a baleful look. Why him and not Winthrop? Thomas had no idea. Thomas shrugged minutely. Sorry, mate, you're on your own. Somehow Kingston got his foot up onto the step of the shovel, helped perhaps by the fact that the blade was half sunk into the ground already.
Good,
said Winthrop encouragingly.
Now put your back into it.
Kingston gave Thomas another look.
Get on with it,
Thomas told him. Kingston took a deep breath, as though he were about to jump over the side of a sinking ship, and put his back into it. There was an audible, sickening snap, like a twig breaking, but wetter somehow, followed by a blood-curdling scream. Kingston was on the ground, and if there hadn't been anything wrong with his leg before, there definitely was now. His trousers were soaked in blood, and when Winthrop, swearing, knelt beside him and pulled the fabric away, Thomas saw a glistening, jagged edge of bone. "Rollins!" he heard himself say. "Blank! Go get a stretcher quick as you can!" They went. Thomas knelt next to Kingston, opposite Winthrop, who was staring at Kingston's injury in shock. "Sir, I've sent some of the men for a stretcher. Is there anything else we need?"
Said Winthrop. No. We should get him to the surgical department as quickly as we can, I should think.
Obviously!
Yes, sir.
To Kingston, he said,
"It's all right, we're getting help."
Kingston nodded, his teeth chattering. Shock, of course. Thomas moved to take off his coat and put it over him, but Major Winthrop managed it first, laying it over the injured man.
"Yes," he said. "We'll, soon have you patched up, not to worry."
Rollins and Plank came back with a stretcher and an M.O. from surgical. They got Kingston loaded up, and Thomas walked back to the surgical hut with him. Winthrop did too, trailing a little distance behind. "Your real fucking job," the wardmaster had said, "is to look out for your lads. Protect them from the fuckers in the brass hats." Kingston hadn't been one of his lads when this all started, but he sure as hell was today. That was why he had looked at Thomas for help when the Major told him to do something he knew would hurt him. Because it was his job. No wonder Theo had nightmares. Thomas stayed with Kingston as long as the surgical team would let him, while they injected him with morphine and tetanus antitoxin, while they cut off his clothes and bathed the wound in antiseptic, while they said fracture of the femoral head and wasn't displaced until he put weight on it. When they took Kingston into theater and kicked Thomas out, he went back to the outer room, both surprised and not surprised to see Winthrop waiting there. "They say he'll be all right if it doesn't get infected," he said. "But there's a high risk when the bone breaks the skin."
"Oh, no."
He clenched his jaw, breathing through his nose. Thomas looked at him for a moment. "I'm going to go tell Rouse," he said finally. "Unless you want to do it." He did not say, "Sir."
"What?"
"Corporal Rouse. He told us this was going to happen. Somebody should tell him he was right."
"Private Rouse,"
Winthrop corrected. It seemed to be automatic. He winced a little afterwards.
"I suppose I—"
He changed course abruptly, his tone growing sharper.
"There was no reason that anyone would expect me to take any heed of the diagnostic opinions of an orderly."
"Except that he was right," Thomas said. Then, "Medical student."
"What?"
"He's a medical student and an orderly, both." Winthrop snorted.
"A second-year medical student. They all think they know everything." He shook his head. "And I suppose you think I disregarded his opinion out of some sort of caste prejudice." "So?" Thomas said, because there was nothing else to say. Winthrop looked at him for a long moment, then finally dropped his eyes. "All right," he said, standing up. "Let's go and talk to Rouse." Mercurial changes of mood and all. Thomas wasn't sure which way Major Winthrop was going to jump when they got to Rouse. He got no new information from a brief stop they made at the X-ray hut in which Winthrop demanded the Kingston films. An orderly on duty produced them, and Winthrop held one up to the light and swore. "Drummond." "Sir?" Winthrop just shook his head and took the films with him as they continued to the guardhouse. Rouse was in a cell, unshaven and dressed in trousers and undershirt. He looked all right, though, and got to his feet when he saw who his visitor was, though he made it plain he was in no particular hurry. Wordlessly, Winthrop handed the X-ray film through the bars. Rouse took it, looking a little uncertain, and held it up to the light as Winthrop had done. He studied it for a long moment, then handed it back. Winthrop cleared his throat. "It is, as you see, an incomplete, non-displaced fracture of the femoral head, matched in his initial evaluation by hysterical paralysis and the absence of any visible signs. In hindsight, when the reported symptoms changed, a thorough medical workup should have been ordered." Rouse nodded. "Yes, sir, that would be my assessment as well." "Unfortunately, under the stress of physical activity, the fracture became complete. Compound, in fact. Snapped like a twig, as I believe you put it when he was made to put his full weight on it. He's in theatre now." Rouse nodded. "Well, sounds like you really fucked the dog." He paused a bit theatrically. "Sorry, sir, I forget myself. I meant to say the dog was fucked. Christ, he really couldn't stop digging himself in deeper, could he?" Major Winthrop sighed. "And you wonder why it's so difficult for those of us not raised in a gutter to take you seriously." "Oh, I think I have a pretty good idea," said Rouse. "Sir." Thomas could see Winthrop looking at the gauntlet Rouse had thrown down and deciding not to pick it up. "I'm not going to argue with you," he said. "I'll talk to Colonel Otley about getting you out of here, but I will not be recommending that you be restored to your rank. You're a bad influence." "If you say so, sir." Major Winthrop shook his head and laughed. Thomas stayed. "What happened?" Rouse asked. Thomas told him, concluding, "I should have listened to you. I was afraid is what I was. I don't know if there's anything I could have done, but I didn't try because I didn't want to end up tied to a post." "It's all right," Rouse began. "No, it's not," Thomas said. "I fucked up. Not anywhere near as badly as he did." He jerked his head toward the doorway from which Major Winthrop had left. "But I fucked up. It was one of mine, and I should have tried." Rouse thought for a moment. "From what I hear," he said, "the only thing you can do when you've really fucked the fucking dog is learn how not to do it next time."